Good afternoon, everyone. I am Zehra, your host, a senior research associate at South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. Today, we are delving onto the interesting subject of intersecting identities, understanding South Asian Muslim societies. Our conversation will cover how culture, social, and religious element come together in a diverse blend of South Asian Muslim communities. Today, we are honored to have Julien Levesque with us, an amazing political sociologist whose research delved onto the complex of socio-political dynamics of South Asian Muslim societies. Earlier to his current position at the University of Zurich, Julian served as a visiting fellow at Ashoka University in India, as he was the head researcher of the Politic of Social Division at the Center of the Science Humans in New Delhi, with a PhD in social sciences from the School of the Advanced Studies in Social Sciences. Julian conducted his groundbreaking research at the Center of South Asian Studies. So please join me in welcoming Julien Levesque. How are you, Julian? Thank you for your time and thank you for joining this online discussion session.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Okay, so I would like to start by your work delve onto the understanding of socio-political dynamics in South Asian Muslim societies. Could you please share the insights from your research that significantly contributed to the understanding of these dynamics and how your background and experience influence your approach to studying in this region?
Yes, well, thanks again for the invitation, for this opportunity to talk to you. And all right, so yes, as you said, I'm interested in the political sociology of South Asian Muslim societies. The idea would be for us to have some points of comparison that would allow us to understand the similarities and differences between various Muslim groups in South Asia across the different states. And for this, of course, so we need to find some points of comparison. But since you drew me to my background and what the kind of work that I've done, so I've had an interest in social movements and progressive movements, and therefore my early research work, actually, my PhD work was on Sindhi nationalism, and something which might be interesting for some of your viewers as well.
Yes.
So the nationalism in the region of Sindh, the Pakistani province of Sindh. And my idea was to look at nationalism from a progressive point of view, as well as something that can, contribute to the construction of society, as opposed to only a conservative movement, as it's often viewed in Europe. And the idea was also to look at the interplay here of an ethnic identity with religion, and in this case, to look at the way Sufi Islam has been used as part of the Sindhi nationalist discourse as a collective identity marker. And so my interest in identity formation and inequality then drew me to questions of lineage and castes. And in fact, the founding father, if you will, of Sindhi nationalism was Syed, so a person who claims descent from Prophet Muhammad, so GM Syed. And so this out of this, I drew some interest, or sparked my interest in so what kind of political and social advantage does such an identity or lineage give you? And so that's how I got interested in questions of caste and inequality among Muslims. And from there, so I worked first on Sayyids, and then I moved to questions of caste, and in India in particular, and more recently, so on the way associations play a role in shaping and reshaping public identities for Muslims and putting out demands in public life. But I think we'll get to that maybe later.
Yes. Thank you for sharing your expertise. Your answer is incredibly clear and insightful. Having said that, yes, you are a visiting assistant professor at Ashoka University and now joining us the University of Zurich. There has been shift in your research focus or methodologies between these academic environment. How has your time at Ashoka University shaped perspectives, and what new dimension do you anticipate exploring in your work at USH?
Yes, that's a great question, actually, and I have you're forcing me to think about this, something I would not have necessarily directly thought about myself in these terms. And of course, they're very different environments. So at Ashoka University, as you mentioned, so I was actually I was a visiting faculty for a year, and of course, it's a very different environment. I mean, the question is teaching South Asia in South Asia in a way, teaching about India in India, or I think the question might be similar, teaching about Pakistan in Pakistan as a foreigner. and then teaching about South Asia in Europe. And of course, I mean, one of the things that struck me, of course, was that in India, well, talking about South Asia directly speaks to the students and to their personal experiences and to their interests, and they have a huge background knowledge. So for instance, on courses, I taught a course on nationalism, I taught a course on social movements, and we had examples from the immediate surroundings. Then it was a couple of years ago, and so the farmers' movement in India, but the NTCA protests, but there were also other cases of social movements, but all of these provided really interesting examples for discussions. And I think for the students, they were very relatable movements. They were not distant experiences. I also taught a course on Pakistan's history, and although that also spoke directly to the students. Some of them may have personal family history connected with partition, and they, again, this huge background knowledge just from hearing about these things in the media and talking with friends and families. Of course, in Europe, it's very different because we need to teach, as we talk about, say, politics, social movements, nationalism, we also need to teach about culture, and we need to sort of develop a cultural proximity because the students may not have this background knowledge that would make these things relevant or directly relatable for them. But then some other things that I noticed moving to Switzerland from India. I'm not Swiss. I am from France. And so Switzerland is also a new environment for me. And I think one of this, I wouldn't say similarities, but points of comparison that I could draw between, say, Switzerland and South Asia is cultural diversity again and federalism. So people in Switzerland, I would say, or in Switzerland, you are aware that there are different languages and different culture, even within the same country, which is not something that many French people experience in this way, right? There's in France much more an idea of cultural uniformity. So in this sense, there are also some interesting proximities.
Thank you for sharing your experience. I'm impressed by your experiences. So yes, moving to the next question. Your paper on the changing nature of caste amongst Muslim explored how caste is related to Islam. What method allow you tracing how caste plays out in everyday life and political organizing?
Yes, thank you. Maybe I might take a few minutes then to come back on this paper that you were referring to. So it's I think what you're mentioning is a text that first came out a few years ago online, debates on Muslim caste, and a very slightly modified version just came out just now as part of the Oxford Handbook of Caste, edited by Surinder Jodhka and Julien Levesque. And so the idea of this paper was to provide a broad synthesis on this question of Muslim caste. And so the starting point would be the apparent contradiction, or how can there be caste almost, right? That's the basic questions, because of course there is no textual theological justification for caste practices in the fundamental text of Islam, the Quran and Hadith. And so that's the basic question. And to answer that, then it's the colonial work give us at least one answer, right? So you can trace in the 19th century how the colonial state gradually built up knowledge on South Asian societies, and through caste and tribe surveys, and then later through the decennial census. I mean, these are the most notable examples. And so the British administrators sought to make sense of Muslim caste. And initially, the early works had a very, I would say, Ashraf-centric view, in the sense that the only real Muslims, in a sense, those who were considered as the only real Muslims were those who claimed a foreign descent, so who didn't claim to be converted from Hinduism or other religions. But gradually, with the census and more expensive surveys, they also covered many different groups, including the occupational castes, or the Peshawar Aqwam. So the groups who do not claim, who did not necessarily claim a foreign descent, but who were occupationally specialized in particular activities. The most famous and well-known cases are, the butchers and meat traders who then called themselves Qureshi from the early 20th century, or the weavers, Julaha, who called themselves Ansari, Momin Ansari from the early 20th century as well. And we can think of other groups, the Rain, or vegetable sellers, and there are other groups. And so these this paints sort of a picture of social stratification among Muslims that was summarized by the sociologist Imtiaz Ahmed as the Ashraf-Ajlaf dichotomy. Of course, Imtiaz Ahmed also sought to criticize this dichotomy that emerged out of the colonial work on Muslim social stratification. Now, in terms of method, since you asked, I think I can only recommend ordinary methods in a way, but I think ethnography is absolutely essential. I think it's essential to go and meet people, spend time with them, to understand their worldviews, and to collect documents. And here I can only advocate for the study, or the in situ study, localized study with people and with organizations that take up this question of caste. And another approach, of course, is historical anthropology, or more broadly history, but using vernacular sources. And I think to understand social stratification among Muslims in South Asia, and how the categories about this were formed since the mid-19th century, how they were also taken up by people themselves, how they were contested and reproduced, and how eventually these categories informed state policies in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh. I think there's a lot of scope for work using vernacular sources.
Very informative answer. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. So also your research paper on the impact of the caste association on minority politics highlight how these association impact political representation patterns. How might they affect differ from other social divisions?
Yes. Well, I'm not so sure, whether they differ from other social divisions, but certainly the question that we have to ask is what is specific about Muslim caste and about movements and organizations based on caste belonging, or say biradri, zat, and there are other terms that may be used by Muslims across regions in South Asia, but movements based on this. So what is specific about them? So as you mentioned, yes, and I'm glad you brought it up. But so recently with Sohaib Niazi, who I think also came on your show recently, we co-edited a special section of the journal Contemporary South Asia on Muslim caste associations. And the idea here was to say, well, so the study of Muslim castes has really revolved a lot around the question of whether there is caste or not among Muslims. And many have recognized in the last few decades that this debate, sort of became a bit redundant, and that we needed new ways of looking at this question, or rather, we could just circumvent this question, because we could agree that whether we use the term caste or not, eventually is not so relevant. What is important is to describe the forms of social stratifications that we see among Muslims. We can then compare them to other religious groups. But once we need to describe them in the terms that they use, first, in the way that makes sense to the people themselves. And so one of the ways we thought this could be done was to look at associations. So there are all sorts of organizations, Tanzime, Sabah. There are different terms that are used for caste-based organizations, Anjumans and Jamiats, and so on. And so these terms point to a wide variety of associations. What is interesting is that these associations, well, they're based on, right, membership is based on the fact that you're born into a certain community. But these organizations, they also transform social relations, right? For example, they often advocate for the use of a particular name. So I mentioned earlier the Qurayshis and Ansaris. Well, if you open, for example, publications of the Momin Conference, which is the major, Momin Ansari organization that exists since the 1920s. Of course, it was almost dissolved at some point, but then it was revived. And so it now still exists, and they have publications, and they stress the need to use the term Ansari as a surname. And you'll find the same dynamics among the Qurayshis. Moreover, these associations, they also often they support a kind of collective or writing of a collective history, right? So very often, but not necessarily all the time, often they seek to tie their origins to the origins of Islam, right? So to find a kind of proximity to the Prophet. Hence, also the surnames that they choose, which refer, of course, to the origins of Islam, Ansari, Qurayshi, and so on. But what's, I think, in the Indian context, then, what is specific about Muslim caste and then Muslim caste movements as compared to, say, Hindu caste-based movements? I think they participate in a lot of the similar dynamics, right? So, for instance, in 1980, in India, you have the Mandal Commission report, which recommends the opening of reservations or quotas to intermediate castes, the OBC, as they are known. And so it was implemented in 1990. And you see many caste groups then establishing organizations and arguing to be included in those reservations. And we find something similar among Muslims. But then what happens among Muslims is that this intersects with minority politics. Because, of course, for Muslims in India and the way they are recognized by the state, they're recognized as a minority. And therefore, as a minority, they have special rights. And, you have, of course, a minority commission, which was actually, it's quite a late development in 2004. But earlier, you have, of course, Muslim personal law that exists. And so having a separate personal law is one of the specific rights granted to Muslims as a minority, and not only to Muslims, it applies to Christians as well. And so, but in a way, as a kind of trade-off, because of that, Muslims are not really part of reservations. Certainly, they cannot be included as scheduled caste, as SC, and that is still the case. And so what is specific about Muslim castes then and about these Muslim caste-based movements is that they have to address the question of the minority status, right? And so what we see in the 90s is the Pasmanda movement emerging and directly challenging the leadership that claims to represent Muslims in India as part of the secular framework. And so that those who represent Muslims as a minority community, then are challenged by the Pasmanda, who say, well, you all come from Ashraf communities, you're all well off, and actually you're not working for the majority of Muslims. You're mainly working to maintain and sustain your own position here. And so that's how the Pasmanda movement emerges. And so what we see since the 90s are multiple debates around this, who can legitimately represent Muslims. Do Muslim organizations represent Muslims? Are they legitimate in representing all the Muslims, or are they not legitimate? And so this affects the way the minority question has been addressed in India since independence.
I want to express my gratitude for your well-explained answer. It's greatly appreciated. Having said that, recently events like AIMIM supporting a caste census and Prime Minister Modi reaching out the Pasmanda Muslims have increased debates. How do these events change the conflict between those claiming to represent all the Muslims and for those advocating for disadvantaged caste groups? How does it affect the overall secular system in India?
Right. Thank you. Thank you. So that's what I was alluding to just a couple of minutes ago. And yes, so again, so this term Pasmanda, which is a Persian term that basically means left behind. And of course, it's not a new term, but in the 90s, it was proposed by a person called Ali Anwar in Bihar. And Ali Anwar started working to bring different marginalized Muslim caste groups together under the Pasmanda banner. And again, the idea was to challenge the Ashraf leadership of Muslim organizations, right? He was not the only one. There were different other leaders. For example, also in Patna, in Bihar, Dr. Ejaz Ali. Ejaz Ali proposed the term Dalit Muslims. And eventually his central point became the revision of Article 341 of the Indian Constitution, which excludes Muslims and Christians from scheduled caste status and protection. Now, maybe I'm stopping here, and maybe you might want to edit out this small. Let me get back to my train of thought. Okay, so coming to recent developments since 2022, it's quite interesting to see that Prime Minister Modi in India has mentioned the Pasmanda in some public events. In July 2022, during an executive meeting of the BJP in Hyderabad, and then also in August 23, during the Independence Day speech, he also mentioned the Pasmanda. And this is not entirely a new thing, actually. Earlier in 2000, I think in the early, even before he became Prime Minister, I think he made some references. And so he's been aware of the Pasmanda groups for some time. And so the Pasmanda demands initially in the 90s were about specific quotas. So the inclusion of the Pasmanda Muslim caste groups into various forms of reservations. And in putting out this demand, they opposed the Muslim organizations who demanded a Muslim quota, right? But again, the Muslim quota, according to the Indian Constitution, is not constitutional. You cannot have reservations based on religion in India. And in a way, you can see that the reason behind this has to do also with pre-partition politics and with the fact that, in 1906, the Muslim League was established and one of its main demands was separate electorates. And in 1909, the British colonial state puts in place the separate electorates. And in a way, this leads, at least in the minds of the constitution makers in India, this leads to a partition in a way, right? So after independence, as the constitution drafters, they get rid of separate electorates. So no more separate electorates for Muslims, but then Muslims and Christians are recognized as minorities. Yeah. And so here this is why then a Muslim quota is understood as unconstitutional, because it would, it was done away with getting rid of the separate electorates in a way. So that would be understood as restoring some form of that. And so because of that, but what happens in practice then, the Indian state towards the question of Muslim caste, its position has changed over the decades. And so I mentioned the Mandal Commission report. And so what happened, in fact, from the 70s is that the states in India started putting in place some forms of reservation for intermediary caste, for the OBCs. And very often they included Muslim groups as early as the 70s, and that became generalized in the 90s. So in practice, many Muslim caste groups, who fall under the Pasmanda banner, benefit from reservations as OBC. And so they have reservation in government employment and in higher education, and at the state and central level. However, the question again of scheduled caste is another question, and that's still in process, and they still do not benefit from SC status. So maybe coming back to your question, we see how so the question of the constitutionality of certain demands based on either religion or on caste, how they have to do with the overall secular framework. So the Constitution of India then recognizes under its secular framework certain rights for minorities and then certain rights for caste groups, marginalized groups. And so the intersection of the two then sometimes leaves some people out, right? It creates some exclusions as well. And so the question of again, scheduled castes for Muslims and Christians, which is now really debated, is one of the exclusions that remain, right? And the debate revolves around whether when a Hindu or when a Dalit converts to Islam, does this person retain her caste background and social identity and occupational specialization? And so is this person still equally marginalized and therefore should benefit from the provisions under scheduled caste, or should this person then, is this person no more marginalized suddenly and should not then benefit from these protections?
Thank you for your excellent input. Your response is truly valuable. So you are familiar with you're studying Muslim social hierarchy in its context and history. How does this approach challenge current stories of Muslim castes, especially those influenced by the Hindu-centric ideas? Also, how does it help us understanding the social dynamics among the South Asian Muslims better?
Yeah, I think what's something that's interesting in the Muslim context with social hierarchy is the connection between lineage and caste. I think lineage then would have to do, really with ancestry and about tracing family ancestry. And so here the case of Sayyids is really a case in point. Families who claim Sayyid ancestry and are recognized as such can provide Shajara and Nasab, so a family genealogy, which is which is always, I should say, patrilineal. So it goes through the male line. And as I think, is quite common knowledge, there are many gaps in these genealogies and there are many aspects that we may question. And I think so this is something that Muslims claiming foreign origins, put forward as a justification. And of course, it's very strong among Sayyids. I don't think you would find it in a similar way among other groups, that would be also understood as dominant groups or ashraf. But it's quite different from the collective histories of the Peshawar Aqwam or the occupational castes, where you don't necessarily, or you don't have these genealogies. And therefore, what you have instead of collective histories, which are quite similar to what you would find among other caste groups. So you generally have a kind of original person that they can collectively trace their, not necessarily their origins in terms of, again, lineage, but in terms of group affiliation. And very often you find a person, for example, in the past who was instrumental in converting to Islam and getting the group to convert to Islam. And here, perhaps, the cases of the Khojas and the Bohras are quite interesting because they refer to an original, preacher or peer who was instrumental in those conversion stories. But again, the question of lineage and caste, they're debated, and I think they're quite interesting. And the interplay of lineage and caste is something that is quite specific to Muslims, the way it plays out in South Asia, and it's something that hopefully in the future we'll see more work exploring this connection.
Yeah, your insights are on point and very well defined. Thank you for your thoughtful response. The last question is about your article that discussed the social superiority association with Sayyidness and Ashraf identity, focus on historical change. And how does this historical perspective provide insight onto the dynamic nature of Sayyidness, and what implication does it have for the broader discussion on the identity and social understanding of Sayyids within the Muslim community, especially in different socio-political and historical contexts?
Yes, well, a few years ago, with another colleague, we co-edited a special issue on Sayyids, which we called Historicizing Sayyidness. And one of the premises was to suggest that, well, we cannot assume that just being Sayyids is enough to understand the actual social location of people, across time and place. And we wanted to draw attention to the historical and also geographical specificities of being Sayyid in different contexts. Of course, one of the broad things that this work had highlighted was in the late 19th century, with the development of the Aligarh Muslim Oriental College under the leadership of Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. So the putting forward as a broad Ashraf identity, but also more in the discourse of Muslim identity as a kind of political community. And so here, the downplaying of aspects of lineage in order to craft or build a common political platform for the promotion of Muslims as a whole. And some of my more recent work, also I've looked at Sayyid organizations, and here I compared to one organization in Sindh, one organization in North India, and one organization in South India, in Kerala. And I think, so one of the aspects that I found very interesting is that all these organizations, they all claim to represent Sayyids in different contexts. And it's quite interesting to see how they understand social boundaries differently. And so the question is, who do they really, what community do they work for? Because they all claim to work for the community, often unspecified. And what you see is that, well, in the Sindhi context, the Sayyid organization is actually, okay, it does represent and work for, the collective welfare or falah behbud of Sayyids, but it's also an ethnic organization because it only includes Sindhi-speaking Sayyids, not Urdu-speaking Sayyids. So in the context of Sindhi, it's also, from the ethnic point of view, it's exclusionary. In North India, the organization I looked at is actually a Shia organization. So it doesn't include any people claiming Sayyid ancestry and of Sayyid status and Sunnis. And in South India, in Kerala, on the other hand, it's a Sunni organization, and which seeks to bring about all Sayyid families in Kerala, but wants to keep out those who are understood as usurpers or claiming Sayyid status or being even recognized as such, but who, from the point of view of the organizers, are not real Sayyids. And also from the sectarian point of view, only Sunnis are included, which in the context of Kerala doesn't exclude so much Shias, but rather the reformists. The reformists are not part of this organization. So what I mean by reformist here are the Salafi or the Nadwat al-Mujahideen in the context of Kerala. So the Salafis who generally would not use anything that would tell their social origins in their names. So they are excluded because to be part of this Sayyid organization in Kerala, you have to follow one of the four mazhabs, so one of the four schools of law, and therefore it excludes some others. So these social boundaries, and we see here how a particular supposedly common lineages or common origins, in fact, play out very differently socially in the different contexts.
Thank you, Julien, for sharing your profound insight on the social political dynamics in South Asian Muslim societies. It has been an enlightening conversation with you. We appreciate your valuable contribution. Thank you for joining this in-depth online conversation. Our audience will surely love this conversation. So until next time, take care, stay safe. Thank you for being here with us today, and take care.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.